It's Ritual Eat, Ritual World. Who can get whom to do what with their bodies? We're all listening to somebody and doing what they say. But to whom are we listening? And what are we doing? For what end goal? Offstage and sometimes thousands of years away, they, whoever they are, write out our ritual scripts. And for good or for ill, we play our parts accordingly. To whom should we be listening? What are the right rituals? What is the goal of our ritual world?
Well, good afternoon. Intense. My name is Cameron Strittmatter. I am the head of production here at the King's College, and I am happy to be your host today. I'm very excited to enact one of my favorite rituals that we do here at the King's College, New York City, a book launch. Today's guest needs very little introduction for most of you. He's been a friend to some, a mentor to many, and arch nemesis of a few, but shockingly vocal minorities. Academia, some heraldry is in order, so I'm going to read this off. The Reverend Dr. Dru Johnson is an editor for the Rutledge Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Biblical Criticism series, an associate director for the Jewish Philosophical Theology Project at the Herzl Institute in Israel, and a co-host of the OnScript podcast, which he occasionally records in my secret lair just across the hallway in the Media Lab. Dr. Johnson has held research fellowships at the University of St. Andrews, Shalem Institute for Advanced Studies, and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He was also named Senior Research Fellow at Carl F. H. Henry Center last fall, and of course, he is an associate professor of biblical and theological studies at the King's College. He's come quite a long way from studying in Scotland to, I think before that, if I am correct, he was in the military where he served in counter-narcotics operations in the Amazon, and prior to that, ran around with a bunch of skinheads, which is why I think he was comfortable with having me moderate today's event. He's written at least 7 books in the last 6 years, which is very impressive. But I think most, did I get those numbers right? It might have been the other way around. But more impressive than any of that, he is a father to 4 children and husband to 1 woman. I am so excited for the things we're going to get into today, but we'll do that in a bit. Up to read some excerpts from his book is the Reverend Dr. Dru Johnson.
Well, it is an honor to have a book launch. I think this is the 6th or 7th book, or the 6th book I've authored, and it's the first book launch I've had, because I didn't know they were a thing, and I'm still not sure what we're doing here. So I was telling a friend over text this morning, I'm not sure what's metaphysically happening in the universe while we do this, what we're launching, and he said, it's the inner launch that really matters. So I'm going for the inner launch right now. I'm going to read since I don't know what to do here, I was just going to read 3 pages that I thought weren't poorly written, i.e. they were very well edited pages by my editor. And also, I think a lot of people skip over the thanks page for good reasons. I mean, when you're a scholar and somebody sends you a book, and you know the person, you look to the acknowledgments to see if your name is in there, right? Then you look in the index to see if they cited your work. But there are people who are worth thanking in detail. There's a lot of people even sitting in this room. Ann Carmen, Carolyn Ratcliffe, who's not here anymore. She's not dead. She just doesn't go here anymore. She graduated. Aspen Scaffa, who's also not dead. And a special thanks to somebody who's watching in Germany right now, Taylor Lindsay, who was my TA, and she's been a good friend of our family, and her mom has read early drafts, and she also read the early drafts of this book, and she said, so it's kind of like you're saying it's a ritual eat, ritual world. And I was like, oh, I am stealing that from you. So I use that throughout, and I also footnote her. But this book started in 2012 when I applied to a grant at the Shalem Institute in Jerusalem, where I started thinking about, when you apply for a grant, you say, well, what would I like to research if I had a year to research on something? So I said, well, I'm really interested in sacramental theology, and why does God tell his people to do things with their bodies in order to be the kind of people they're supposed to be in the world? And why does he tell us to do such weird things with our bodies? Eat weird meals and take weird baths and all these other things. And so that's where it started, and a lot of this book came from an earlier book that I wrote, a geeky, nerdy version of the book. But this book began in a churrascaria in Atlanta in 2015. In November 18th, probably, I don't know the exact day, when Lil Copan, an editor for Erdman's, said, hey, would you like to get together for lunch and talk about a possible book? And I was like, sure. And so we got together, and she said, how do you think about writing a popular book? You know, a book anybody could read and understand, not just your nerdy friends. I said, oh, no, I can't do that. I'm not a good writer. And she goes, oh, I'll whip you into shape, writing-wise. And so... Well, I would also like to thank, my colleagues here at King's College, my students here at King's College, who obviously have helped whip me into shape. My church, who everybody, if you know me, if you had a class with me, I'd never stop talking about my church because it's been so foundational in our family's life. But also Lil Copan, who was the editor for this book. She's the one who coached me and taught me how to write like a normal person. And I'll just quote myself in the acknowledgments. Brutal honesty is my love language, and Lil is fluent. She sent me entire chapters back saying, rewrite this, and I don't mean rewrite this, I mean throw this away and start over from scratch. So this book has, I started in earnest in 2015, and it's now, 2019? That's the longest I've ever spent on any book. And you will now read it and think, why? And I somehow managed to pull out the bookmark of where I was going to read. So let me see if I can find it. The chapter is called, I need to get it right. The chapter that I want to read from is called Priestly Monkeys Banging on Their Ritual Typewriters, which I tried to convince the publisher to title the book that, and they would not go for it. And the section that I want to read from is about death rituals. The ritual scripts that are handed to us from our traditions. And so I'm just going to read a few pages, and I'll try to animate the reading as best I can. In his book, The Liturgy of Death, Eastern Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann attacks the American funeral machine. Why? The funeral machinery wants to medicalize and conceal death from us, quote, to render that loss for us, the survivors, as something painless, smooth, and unnoticeable as possible, end quote. Schmemann continues, quote, in its attitude towards death, a culture defines and reveals its understanding of life's meaning and goal, end quote. In other words, American culture creates this script shaping not only our view of grief, but also our view of life itself. Schmemann asks us to consider this question. By what right do we let the funeral machine script our death rituals? To broaden this question out, we might ask, by what right do we let the machinery of our culture script our daily rituals? And what other cultural traditions do we dutifully follow without question? Who would have thought that survivors could sort out death by a disconnected phone in a booth? After the 2000 tsunami that struck Japan, there you go. The 2011 tsunami that struck Japan, entire villages mourned the loss of friends and family. How could the communities deal with such pain on a massive scale? When the Japanese funeral machine went silent, one man had a simple idea to help the people engage with their loss. He transformed a common action, making a phone call, into a grieving ritual, talking to the dead in a phone booth. The phone booth is normal in every way, except the phone doesn't work, at least not in the usual sense of the word. The booth sits secluded on the man's rural property. This is actually the booth itself here. Though the phone isn't hooked up, the grieving come to connect. Survivors can be seen dialing numbers known only to them, and then they talk to their dead. The ordinariness of this ritual seems to help them navigate this extraordinary circumstance. It gives them what scientists call deliberately controlled gestures to follow. The conversations they have with their dead sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, children, friends, and more shock those who haven't spent much time around the grieving. Here's one such conversation from a man to his parents, to his wife, who is called Mine, and his infant son, who's called Issei. They all perished in the tsunami. The man speaks these words through the phone, in the booth, and through his tears. And I think his pain deserves to be read slowly. Dad, Mom, Mine, Issei, it's been 5 years already since the disaster. If this voice reaches you, please listen. Sometimes I don't know what I'm living for. Issei, please let me hear you call me Papa. Even though I built a new house. Dad, Mom, Mine, Issei, without all of you, it's meaningless. I want to hear your reply, but I can't hear anything. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. It's wrenching stuff. How would we console him? What path would we trace for him to walk out? This man is like many others who come here. In this booth, they talk without shame to the dead, as if they were on the other end of the line. The phone in the booth provides familiarity and privacy, and the conversations are strange and soul-bearing at the same time. They expose the furthest reaches of a human's being. The disconnected phone actually works. In such times, grieving people have to do something. So even when a man creates an unusual new tradition, people try it. What's interesting, and I think it's significant, is that the mourner's phone booth strategically modifies an everyday practice so that grieving families might be able to discern a way forward, to detect the trail from the sheer jungle of their loss. Traditions can also create more detailed ritual scripts. Jewish tradition has well-known death rituals for survivors too. Their rites have historical and sometimes faintly biblical roots. For instance, someone must sit with the body of the deceased at all times until burial. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called sitting Shiva, where Shiva refers to the 7 days of mourning, which include fasting from the normal pleasures of life. After burial, ritual mourning continues. Loved ones may wear torn clothing as a sign of their grief, and different traditions within Judaism may extend the period of mourning to a year, depending on one's relationship to the dead. But mourning has final punctuation. After the period of mourning ends, it's no longer appropriate to mourn. For most Jews, these rituals are not optional. The community expects them, just as Christians usually expect a memorial service and a cemetery burial. But despite the cultural pressure to perform these rituals, that pressure doesn't necessarily diminish their value to the mourners. Though not particularly religious anymore, Jonathan Safran Foer writes about this aspect of Jewish death rituals, noting that we need such deliberately controlled gestures just at these moments. He says this: Judaism gets death right. It instructs us what to do when we know least well what to do and feel an overwhelming need to do something. You should sit like this. We will. You should dress like this. We will. You should say these words at these moments, even if you have to read them from a transliteration. We will. I think that really captures very well how ritual can be helpful at times when you don't know what to do or what to say or how to dress. And you know, the Jewish rituals for mourning the dead tell you what to do for all of those things. Traditions offer numerous and helpful rites, and that might also make some of us in this room nervous. The problems with traditions authoring our rituals may feel like a long train a-comin'. As my Jewish friends tell me, they've been struggling with this problem for millennia. They feel the weight of the wealth of their ritual traditions, and this forces the big question: where do my daily and regular rituals find their roots, and according to whom? On the whole, religious Jews tend to think of their religion not in terms of theology, but in terms of practice. What do we do when we're in situation X, Y, or Z? Should my ritual scripts come from deep within the history of my tradition, or can I improvise? The resolution to such quandaries always mixes tradition and improvisation, but should the ratio lean more towards past traditions or towards present freedom to improvise? In other words, who makes this stuff up? In the original draft, I said, "We do," and then the editor struck it out. Just a note. Christians face a similar quandary today. Although the Christian tradition is centuries long and rich in ritual, many of us have to plead ignorant in its existence, much less its bounty of rituals. In the book Deep Church Rising, the author suggests that we delve into the historic and the small c Catholic rituals of the church. And by studying and reappropriating the ritual life of the church that has always been prized, we can find a safe way forward. But maybe you, like me, shiver at the thought of studying Scripture and the history of the church in order to be guided by them today. But the sober reality is that you are currently being guided by many religious and cultural rituals already scripted out for you. The funeral machine has already scripted your final service, just as the wedding machine has already planned your nuptial day. The worship music machine has already ritualized your Sunday morning songs. The sports machine has scripted and ritualized your leisure time. The fitness machine has scripted your exercise, which then shapes your vision of what an acceptable body looks like, and then maybe the shame or the hubris that accompanies it. The fashion machine has scripted every color, fabric, and cut that we are ritually wearing right now. The successful career machine, the career family balance machine, and more are pumping out the scripts of your rituals like priestly monkeys banging on liturgical typewriters. Need I go on? And all good rituals can be twisted, perverted towards an end not intended by God. Family meals can be gluttonized, guilty. Nutrition can be anorexized. Exercise can descend into egoistic sports competitions and body bragging. Parenting can devolve into power struggles. Sexual intimacy can contort into pornographic reenactments. Scripture reading can be corrupted into daily doses of bibliolatry, the worship of the Bible itself. As one witty person, you know who you are, quipped to me, it's a ritual, eat ritual world. The cultural monkeys continually write and publish scripts for us, voices to whom we already listen. Yet Scripture reiterates throughout that we must understand God's instruction and how it has gone wrong in us. Only then can we faithfully practice and improvise our ritual lives in community. That's quite enough.
The rituals of life. They're handed down to us, from ordinary routines to sacred rites of passage. We embody and repeat these rituals. Washing clothes, playing video games, practicing long division, sizing up a plumbing job, scanning a spreadsheet, reading an X-ray. These scripted acts enable us to know the world. They form us, shaping our ability to see things others can't, to understand complexities others haven't yet experienced. So, what rituals are we embodying? And how are they changing our understanding?
Hi.
Hi.
This is exciting. Olivia, are you in the room? I don't even know if that... Oh, there you are. A round of applause for Olivia for putting all of those together, by the way.
That was going to be my first order of business.
Is it? Yes. Sassy.
Yes. Excellent work, Olivia.
Well, thank you for having me up here, one. This is a delight. They always keep me in the back in the dark, and so it's fun to be up on the stage instead of...
Well, your middle name is Dangerous.
This is about me
I might
now.
point out.
I loved reading your book. I have so many different places I could start from, and I'm glad that you brought up your preferred title. There's a lot of ways in. It deals with memory, with death, with gestures, with God, and being, all light subjects, and scripts, which I think all ties up very neatly and saliently into all of my concerns with True Detective Season 3. So I'd like to start there.
I have not seen any of
Oh,
True
it's totally
Detectives.
fine.
Yeah, just summarize seasons 1 through 3 really quickly for
Sure.
me.
Season 2 never happened. Season 1, McConaughey and what's his bucket. It's fabulous. And then it's, pardon?
What is that?
Oh, it's a recurring detective show on HBO, the home box office. But in
I
season
think it's like Law and Order, but more lighthearted.
yes, definitely a little more. But in season 3, without spoiling too much, Mahershala Ali plays Detective Wayne Hayes, and you go through different phases of his life. So it's cool. You are following his perspective on a certain crime that one in the 70s, and then 10 years later, and then I think 20 years later. So he's an old man, he's in middle age, and he's young, and at each point he intersects with this mystery at the heart of everything that he never really manages to solve until certain things happen, and then maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. Without giving anything away, at the end, we learned at the beginning that he was in Vietnam, and he was a recon Marine. Yeah. He was in recon in the jungle, and I was like, oh, Dru Johnson. And that these skills, if nothing else, really lend towards his ability to detect things other people wouldn't. And so he encounters this mystery. He's dealing with memory loss the entire show, and I think it's fascinating. And at the end, the last image, which doesn't ruin anything, no spoilers here, is him young again in the jungle in Vietnam, looking around with an almost indeterminate look on his face, and then he presses off into the thicket of the Vietnamese jungle alone. And that stuck out when I was reading probably one of my favorite excerpts from your book. It says, all of us will be confronted with circumstances that leave us breathless and scriptless. Some of these circumstances are sudden and intrusive. Other times they are creeping and inevitable, akin to being dropped into the thick of a jungle. Scriptlessness envelops us, and no clear route emerges, no path to chop or trudge. And I don't know, how would you feel about me suggesting that I think that mystery is kind of at the heart of what this entire book is trying to tackle? Is that?
That is creepy. I don't know, you guys don't know what just happened because we've never, ever talked about this. I don't think I've talked to anybody. There was a section in that chapter that was excised by my editor, and probably rightly so, about one of those points in my life where you just kind of have I was a young man in the military working in Colombia. I was out on a patrol with Colombian conscripts, and in my mind, my dad was in Vietnam. He's a Vietnam vet, and so in my mind, movies, I brought my machete with me, and little did I know you don't need a machete to do patrol in the jungle, because the last thing you want to do is let people know where you were. And when you hack down all the branches and make a little trail, you're telling everybody where you are. Like, I just never thought about the logistics of that, right? And so we're confronted by this jungle and these 15-year-old conscripts in galoshes and, carrying their beat-up effing foul rifles. They just head right out. And it was only as what I thought we were trudging through the jungle that I realized, oh no, we're on a trail. And they were very carefully bending branches back to make sure, the one in front would bend things out of the way, the one in back would reconstruct the trail so that you couldn't see it anymore. And I just remember thinking, wow, I would totally get killed out here by myself without these 15-year-old kids. Like, it would just be over so quickly and I wouldn't even know it. Maybe a cool breeze I'd feel through my head as the bullet passed through, but that was it. These are things you think about out in the jungle. But so I had a whole story about that in the chapter, which Lil very dutifully said, yeah, you don't need all that stuff. The military stuff is too heavy. So I left one military story only in there from boot camp. But that was a moment of awakening, which all I could think to myself is, how did they look at this jungle and see trails? Mm-hmm. And how could I be looking at the exact same thing and see nothing but jungle? And they're younger, and they're ill-trained. I came through the American military, so I felt like I had this good training. Their training was like hackneyed and out in the middle of the jungle, and I just, it was one of those humbling moments where I'm like, I think I need these 15-year-old kids around me. Like, they might be useful. They might know a lot more than I. Workers. Yeah. Exactly. They seem to know a lot more than I do, and I should just shut up and learn. Yeah.
Fabulous.
So how did you know that? That's what I'm trying to figure out. That's so weird.
I Googled it.
Oh, okay.
No, it was because the season ended last weekend, and it was just weird that they connected as well as they did. You talk a lot about scriptlessness in the opening of your book, and then kind of throughout. And to guide us into this, you reference East of Eden quite a bit as a wonderful illustration of what scriptlessness can look like.
Yeah.
And by the time I arrived at the end of the thing, my question is there actually such a thing as scriptlessness? And I don't know if that needs unpacking or if that's a useful starting point.
Yeah, and I got scriptlessness from an interview on NPR. I was listening to, I think, Alif Baltaman, who just said that in her 20s she felt scriptless. And I was like, as soon as I heard that, I thought, that's exactly how we all feel in our 20s. Like, we don't know anything, and there's no there's no trails, right? Or it doesn't seem like there are trails, or all the trails have been removed and it's all been mushed over. So I think at the end, I think you're right. There is no such thing as scriptlessness, but life at times feels very scriptless, right? And so it's in those moments. And I think death is a big one. I talk about the death rituals in the Hebrew Bible a bit, and I tie them to Joan Didion, the other D. Joan Didion, some of the things she says about just like, when somebody dies, it's not like you're missing them or they're lost. It's just like a void. Like, it's just a occlusion where there's nothing there. And we just don't know how to deal with nothingness. I mean, here's an interregnum plug. Chaos and order, right? And that we are not just order-making machines, but God has created us to actually like implot ourselves in a narrative. And sometimes the narrative gets whacked perpendicularly from the side, and you can't know what to make of it. But I think that's actually a really dangerous. It's a good point to be at if you're surrounded by wise people. It's a really dangerous place to be at if you're surrounded by fools, because people will hand you scripts. So I give the example of, I have students who come into my office and they're depressed because of some life circumstance, and their roommates will just say, well, you just need to go like on a 36-hour video game playing binge.
Classic.
And I'm like, no, why would you do that? Like, why? And that in that sentence is, why would you listen to your roommates? They're your same age. They have no experience. They have no wisdom. They don't know what this looks like 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later. I have people who are 10 and 20 years older than me that I constantly go to and say, what do the things that I'm doing right now, what do they look like after my kids have moved out, if they've gone to college, if they get married? So it's those moments where I think people will exploit you either for ill or just not knowing any better, right? Or also I get dating advice that I hear people report to me, or romance advice, and I'm like, and I'm trying to not say out loud, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I don't usually succeed in holding that in, but what they're and it's always their roommates. But what their roommates are doing is they're handing them scripts. They think they're just giving advice, but they're actually handing them a script, and they just got handed that script from some TV show or from some sentiment they read somewhere in some novel or a magazine. And so the call is to inspect those scripts, to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves, right?
That's in the Bible.
Yep.
That's a thing. Our next seminar that we have up here will
Hezekiah 4:4.
Yes. Nahum. That's a great jumping off point, I think. I was going to talk about the phone booth, and so I'm thrilled that you brought it up. Am I wrong in saying that rituals, as many things, one of their purposes served is that they function as a nearly death-proof time capsule, like things that can be passed down, so that even though the adherents expire, the ritual lives on and then keeps. I'm just going to trail off there.
Yeah, no, I in Introduction to the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, I talk about this in Deuteronomy. I actually often have them read an article called "The Death or Digital Oblivion." This problem that's always over the horizon, that whatever technology or media you're using right now, nobody will be able to read it or understand it 10,000 years from now. So how do you make things that communicate into the future, especially things like Yucca Mountain, where we're piling lots of nuclear radiation? Like, how do you tell people in the future? Actually, Finn is here. She's the one who turned me on to this article a long time and got me thinking about this when she was a freshman, probably, right? And it's had me stirring on it. So that's why, again, students are part of this book as well. And what's beautiful to me is Deuteronomy, which is the book of memory for biblical scholars. They talk the you shall remember, you shall remember. And how shall you remember? Well, part of it is you're to speak about these things with your children over Passover rituals. When you encounter these stone monuments by the side of the Jordan River, it's supposed to initiate a conversation. So the stone monument actually creates a ritual. It creates an occasion to talk about these things with your kids. But also, the only thing Israel is commanded to remember is not systematic theology, it's a song in Deuteronomy. And songs also happen to be the most memory resistant. So, because they spread out all throughout the brain. So if you lose one part of your brain, the song. So if you know people with
Ariana Grande.
Yeah, so there's a downside, a deleterious side to it is be careful what songs you're listening to, because if you have Alzheimer's or dementia, that might be the only thing you remember at that point in your life. I'd never thought about that implication, but that preaches, I can see. Yeah, so Israel is commanded they're unlike anybody else in the ancient Near East, where there's all this emphasis on pass this to your children. All of these systems are to your children, to the generations, to the children, and they hand their children a calendar and a suite of rituals, not textbooks, not systematic theologies, which will all one day be unreadable, but a life to be lived out to form and shape them correctly.
You wrote that if death causes us to lose track of the trail, then death rituals ought to reorient us and give us a process path back into the realm of God's charge. And I love that. The one thing that kind of flipped my lid, I'm about to get married in about a month or so, which is exciting. This is about me again. And I absolutely loved the part where you're like, by the way, Christian marriages, totally made up. Scripts that we've been handed. Where did they come from? And that'll lead me into my next question. What do you do when rituals start to collide with each other? So one, where the heck did marriage come from?
That marriage is biblical.
Right.
The wedding ceremony.
The ritual
is basically made up.
Yeah.
The term I use is improvised,
Yes.
right? So towards the end there's a great quote from a jazz pianist who says, the goal of jazz is to learn the rules and then break them with taste, right? To improvise. And the fact is we're always improvising. I always tell my students, when you get to Leviticus, the rules for the rituals there seem exhausting until you try to perform any one of those rituals and you realize there's not enough rules there. It doesn't tell you what to do. There's not enough performance information. In the same way that, maybe a musical score, there's lots of different ways you can play the same simple songs. I like listening to lots of iterations of the same piece, like Chopin's Nocturne I've been listening to in B flat a lot lately on guitar and piano and other things. And they are the same piece, but they're performed very differently by different performers, different instruments. And so I think weddings are one of those things that is, there's not much, it says you need to be married if you're going to pump out babies and raise them in the fear of Yahweh. And I always tell people when I full disclosure, I'm doing his wedding. I'm the officiant for his wedding, but I always tell people, when people say, well, what's the most minimal thing we have to do? And I'm like, well, you basically both have to agree that you want to marry each other, and then we can.
And then you high five.
I can sign the paper. You don't even need the high five. That's extravagant, right? Yeah.
Ritual.
You don't need rings. You don't need anything. So I think what we're doing, and of course my wedding was a typical 1990s wedding culture wedding. And I think what we're doing, though, in those moments when we wear weird clothes and we walk funny and we talk funny and we stand awkwardly and we have all our family there to watch this unfold in front of them, we're acknowledging that something different is happening here. This is not the same this is not the same suit and tie that I wear anywhere else. It's not the same dress, and I tell my classes, you shouldn't wear that dress ever again anywhere. Don't wear it to somebody else's wedding. Don't wear it to a ball. That dress is for that day only, right? If you're wearing the big white one. And that we're just acknowledging there's something weird going on here. And that's, I noted it in the death rituals, that all rituals, this is the definition I think that works the best across Scripture and reality, is all rituals are some normal practice strategically changed for a purpose. And so you have to think about what's the normal practice, how is it changed, and what's the goal, right? And that'll help us because later in the book, I get to things like communion, where everybody says, "Okay, you can have bread. Can you have grape juice?" A lot of people are like, "Okay, grape juice is fine. Okay, well, what about seltzer water?" Is that okay? Can it be a corn muffin?
Delicious.
Like as soon as you say corn, because you're getting medium and message mixed up here, right? And if it's a corn muffin, well, can we go all the way to a Dorito chip to stay on the corn product trope here, right? And at some point, people are going to go, no, that's not communion anymore. And all they're pushing back on is that there's some nodal instruction. There's some way that it's supposed to be. There's some immovable part of communion that you can drift far enough away that it doesn't feel like you're doing that thing anymore. So I don't think it's an accident that Jesus probably used red wine to symbolize blood.
And Cooler Ranch Doritos.
And Cool Ranch Doritos, yeah. And I think we're constantly, the collide issue, we're constantly colliding our rituals together. I'm a professor. All I do all day long is prescribe rituals for a group of people and ask them to embody them both in front of me and then behind my back at home, right? And we're bringing those parts together. And so I don't think you can get out of it this thick matrix of rituals. It's to be more awake or to be more woke to what the matrix is, who's handing you the traditions, and what are the parts that are immovable and what are the parts that you can kind of free improvise.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, specifically interpreting what's a ritual and what's just little blips in the matrix. In 2016, you penned a much heftier tome called Knowledge by Ritual, and I loved it mostly because you used the word prolegomenon in it, in the title. In the title. A biblical prolegomenon to sacramental theology.
Yeah. That's when you really don't want to sell books. You title, yeah. That's a cocky title right there.
It's going to be my son's first name, so that he might be beat up.
As long as it's your first son, that'll work.
Yes. And so in that, you talk a little bit about metaphors and reference the 1980 work, Metaphors We Live By.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And in that, right about then, somatic epistemology had become a hip thing where people sort of parse metaphors as distilled understanding. And so you did a really wonderful job of explaining that loaded sentence by talking about magic eye pictures of sharks, marching in the army, and
Air Force. I was in the Air Force.
In the Air Force, excuse me. Yeah.
I wanted to join the military, but I joined the Air Force instead. But
this is live streamed. You better watch out.
That's okay. Air Force people know it's true.
So yes, magic eye pictures, sharks, and marching in the Air Force. How do those kind of coalesce into understanding rituals? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I mean, the marching one I bring up, I think in the introduction of this book as well, is it's just, in boot camp, the rituals are so heavy and absurd. Like you naively on the first day, they're like, we're going to chow, and you march in there and you pick up a fork. And then the next thing you know, someone's screaming at you at the top of your lungs. You're like, wait, what did I do, right? And you violated some invisible rule. And I talk about the one that we all remember is, shining your boots, which apparently they don't have to do anymore, and folding your underwear with tweezers and a ruler into 4-inch squares, where you
like we all do.
Yes, and you got to get the edges all perfectly straight. And any reasonable person, at some point, you're just asking yourself the question: why are they making us do these things? Right? They're either just cruel, or they all of these little rites point to something. And so I think that's. I think what happens is we think, and I think this bleeds into our practices of communion and baptism, we think that it's all symbols, and we just need to decode the symbols so that we can understand what's going on there. And I think the more you look at rituals, and I use Mr. Miyagi as my favorite example. If you haven't seen Karate Kid, then I'm sorry. The real one, there's only one real one. But wax the car, sand the deck, paint the fence. It's Daniel's son is lost. He's like, why? I came to train to learn karate from Mr. Miyagi, and he's having me do housework for days on end. And
clever.
Yeah, and he is. I think this is in the chapter I call. It's a quote: "All journeys have a secret destination of which the traveler is unaware." And Mr. Miyagi had snuck karate into his body. This is nice. I like how I'm saying this. He had snuck karate into his body through these practices that he couldn't understand. He was doing them because he trusted the person who was scripting these rites for him. But he had no idea how this was working. And to the moment where he snaps, he says, "Forget this, you're just trying to get a slave out of me." And he tries to walk away, and Mr. Miyagi shows him at that point that he shows him in his body that he's actually taught him karate through all these practices. And I tell students oftentimes, like, if I'm doing my job right as a professor, you won't figure out half the tricks I'm playing on you until years from now. Or maybe if you start teaching, you'll look back and go, I see what he was doing now, right? So the idea that you're supposed to be woke to the whole system when you go through, and it's all just symbols that are encoded, and all you have to do is decode them like a parable, which a parable you do have to decode.
Or Neo.
Or
The
Neo,
Matrix.
yes. Yeah, like, this is conspiracy theory hangs up on this very point, is they think it's all encoded and you can just decode it. And I'm saying, no, most of life is, if you trust somebody and you know that they're leading you the right way, they love you and they care for you and they're trying to show you something, then often, we know this as children, you just have to go along with it. You have to do it in the trust that it's going to show you what it needs to be shown. And I can't help but think that Israel has the same problem, that they have to like do a bunch of stuff that they just have to trust this is going to form them into a just people, that the church has the same problem where Jesus is saying, now I want you to do this funky thing with the Passover meal, and now I want you to take that baptism thing that you're aware of in the Jewish sense, but now I want you to make it a one-off thing. Don't do it anymore. Don't do it weekly at the synagogue. Don't do it daily if you're an Essene or someone at Qumran. Do it once. So he's monkeying with the practices that they've already ritualized. He's re-ritualizing rituals. And it's clear if you read the Gospels, they don't understand any of this. Right. They are completely clueless. But that saying that we love to quote, when he's like, "Why are you still hanging around me when I told you that you have to be a cannibal?" And they say, "Where else are we going to go, right? We trust you. You are Mr. Miyagi."
And you walked us into the middle of the desert, so there's that.
There's that technique as well, yeah. Make them pay a lot of money on the front side, and then they're kind of stuck with you. Yeah, there's a lot of, you can learn a lot of sales techniques here as well from the book.
Speaking of the book, so you do a wonderful job of unpacking the idea of ritual, and then you lead us to the troubling idea, especially because all along the way you also suggest that good understanding of our ritual world comes from when those rituals lead back to God's communication to us through ritual, and that as those unfold. So, but then you bring up the troubling question yourself: what happens when those rituals fail us? What was your intent with that second half of the book? What the heck do we do? And where do we go from there?
To quite literally, as Stanley Hauerwas prayers, to scare the hell out of everybody who reads it. So that they will
jokes.
And I mean that in the sense of I don't think Christians. So the second half of the book is more oriented towards Christians. The first half is just like everybody can get along there, right? But to really get you to think, to ask yourself this question, the prophets of Israel, including Jesus, the Apostle Paul, Peter, and the prophets of the New Testament, all at some point out that God hates the worship of the people of Israel. Like he's mad at them about their worship. But if you just watch them, they're doing all the right stuff. Right. They're doing all the maneuvers, as it were. So that to me should scare us into asking the question, well, are we actually faithfully improvising the rituals that God has given to us in all areas of our life, from how we build our houses to how we treat our families to how we treat the poor and the vulnerable? Are we faithfully improvising this life, or does God hate what we're doing? Even in our churches. I mean, I think it's a legitimate, every worship leader I think should ask, is our worship a stench rising up to Yahweh? That's a possibility on the table, right? And I think you have enough instances where I talk about addiction, where it goes dark. I talk about eloquence. That's one of my favorite chapters that the editor, again, did not buy into, but I'm still sold on, is that TED Talks have become this very eloquent form of speech, and it turns out that not only do you not learn anything more by listening to a TED Talk, but you get fooled into thinking that you learned way more than everybody else. And it's like the worst kind of learning ever, is that you think you learned more than you actually did, which is some kind of anti-learning or counter-learning. I don't know what you would call it. But a TED Talk is taking a good, earnest, conversation with somebody, or a lecture, which can be a good form of a ritual, and it's twisting it in this way, and it's squeezing the best parts of it, but it's leaving, or it's the most appetizing parts, but it's leaving out the most necessary parts. So I'm a lecturer, so obviously I believe that it's an okay ritual to stand in front of people and talk about something and force them to think through it. But there's a way that can very quickly turn sideways on you And if you don't know how rituals work, then you can't pay attention to how it turns sideways. You just aren't aware of how it turns sideways. So everybody loves TED Talks. I love them too. I think a lot of them, though, are not good learning. Mm-hmm. In fact, they're counter-learning.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what that is.
Oh, TED Talk. Yeah, thank you very much. TED Talks are, it's a phenomenon of pop education from the internet, from YouTube, where people stand up who are subject matter experts and give like 10-minute memorized, Toastmasters speakers.
10-minute talk.
Yeah, it's like a quick, to-the-point talk, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sort of like a book launch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
Wonderful. I think so. Expanding from that, at the end you suggest your own karate lessons, at least in synthesizing what you provided and then how best to move forward. What are you hoping to see from the person who reads this book, and if they glean anything at all from it?
Yeah, I hope they will come over to my house and sand my deck, paint my fence. Seriously, it's 304 Jersey Street.
I'll see you Saturday.
Jersey. I think at the very end I give an inventory where I very shamefully walk through my own daily rituals, weekly rituals. I just inventory a few of them. Like I play Candy Crush to go to bed at night. Not on my phone, on my laptop.
Mentally.
Right? Yes. Yeah. So, in fact, I'm playing it right
Triple
now.
points.
And I just walk through the question, what is the ritual? So I just give a series of questions. What is the ritual? Where did it come from? So who handed me this script? To what end is it aimed at? How can it go dark or how can it go sideways on me? And then how should reflection, how should I moderate my behavior in light of all of that? And I give several examples from pedestrian ones like playing Candy Crush before I go to bed, to slightly more profound ones, and then I leave the readers with a bunch of blank spots, like, now it's your turn. You should do this yourself. And that's actually the goal of the book. It is not, I know a lot of people are going to want to read the book and say, and they'll ask me, like, so what do you think about communion? How should it be done? What's the right biblical way? And I say, no, the point of the book is for you to think about what right improvisation of that looks like in your community. What right improvisation of, things like how much should your phone be in your pocket or connected to your body? How much should you do? How much time should you spend speaking face to face with other people? How much time should you be touching other people in appropriate ways, of course? And thinking about all the normal rituals and how the biblical rituals are actually not any really, and categorically, they're not any different than all those normal little rituals of getting coffee with a friend. They have different goals to different ends, trying to show you slightly different, but they fit the same pattern. Mm-hmm. So to kind of unify your view that everything you're doing is basically, that we're ritualed creatures,
right.
That you can't help it. And we're also practicing ritual scripts, so getting us to kind of think about where they're coming from and how we're practicing them and how that's shaping our vision of the world. I think the one thing that is the contribution here is that is not in some other books on liturgies, which are some great ones, like Tish Warren Hardin's Liturgy of the Ordinary is a fantastic book. But one of the things that I think is especially insightful from Scripture, or that I learned from Scripture, is that these things aren't just shaping habits in you. I think we think of rituals as whether they're shaping good or bad habits. They're actually crafting the way you see the world. They determine whether you can actually see the kingdom of God in the world or not, according to Scripture. And so they're what we call epistemological. They shape our knowledge and understanding of reality. And if that's true, then we need to be darn careful about which ones we're doing.
You've written something that, looked at as a whole, becomes troublingly, I would say, fractal, where a fractal is something where you're looking at it, and the deeper you look, the more of the repetition goes deeper to pour pop culture on it. I love recently Netflix's show Maniac. Just obsessed. Yeah.
That's a good one.
And the thing they keep saying maddeningly through the whole thing is that the pattern is the pattern. And I think that is also very close to the heart and soul of this book. Yes, I think that just about does it on time for us.
I think we're on time.
I've very much enjoyed reading your book and discussing it here.
Vielen Danke?
Yes, wonderful. I believe that...
Jawohl.
Marvelous.
Auf Wiedersehen. Now we've said all my German words.
Impressive.
Yeah.
for more German, I think that Dru will be hanging out near his books right after this.
Sure.
Yeah, so please feel free to come up and talk to us or help me sand his deck later. Thank you so much, Dru Johnson.
Yes, thank you, Cameron, and thank you all.